when the war broke out, I was 15 and worked for a butcher. When I was 17, with the war going on and Liverpool being bombed and blitzed and Manchester bombed and blitzed, I wanted to do something a little extra. So I always wanted to join the Air Force. So a friend of mine, a school friend of mine, and I went to the recruiting office in Manchester to try and join the Air Force. They told us we're both too young, come back when you're 18, which was in a year's time. In the meantime, I still wanted to do something, and my father was in the Merchant Navy. So I went to Liverpool, unbeknownst to him, and joined this troopship, the Empress of Asia. We embarked 2,500 troops and joined a convoy bound for the Middle East, which most troopships were doing then. But when we got to Durban, the Japanese had come in the war, and instead of going on to the Middle East, we dropped the troops that embarked at Liverpool at Durban, went across to Bombay empty, and picked up special troops at Bombay to take, I didn't know at the time to where, but it eventually turned out to be Singapore. The day before we arrived due to arrive in Singapore, I got my first really taste of war when 27 Japanese bombers came over and bombed the convoy. They missed our ship, but there was shrapnel everywhere. And the following day, the same 27 bombed the ship again. I joined as a butcher. There was 7 of us, 4 assistant butchers and 3 chief butchers. We lived in a small glory hole, fore to a glory hole, down in the bowels of the ship, and worked from 6 o'clock in the morning till often 7, 8 o'clock at night. There were 2,500 troops, and with an hour off at 11 o'clock. At 11 o'clock on the day before we arrived in Singapore, these 27 Japanese bombers came over, dropped the bombs, all at one go, but they never hit any ships as I know of. But the following day, again at 11 o'clock when I was up on the deck, the 27 came over. They didn't drop bombs, but Singapore was burning heavily. They were setting fire to it. And off they went, these 27 into the black smoke. They then came back in 2s and 3s to attack the convoy. And as ours was the biggest ship in the convoy, they bombed the Empress of Asia first. We were hit with about 5 or 7 bombs and set on fire. All the lifeboats were burning, bar one. And I was up on the lifeboat deck when I was called to go and man a hose. So I manned this hose, and it was an impossibility. There was hardly any water. I think one of the bombs had hit the main pipes. And so it was to abandon ship. All the lifeboats were on fire, or one way or other. So, and I was on the very top deck. There was an Australian sloop or destroyer, came to the rear of the Empress of Asia, nosed into the rear end of it, and took off about 1,000 troops. The rest of us then found different ways. I climbed, some were jumping from this very top deck, but the life belts in those days the troops had were big cork ones. Tried to stop them from jumping in because as soon as they hit the water, these cork life belts would jar the neck, and it was a tremendous height, really, a troopship deck. So I wandered down, came across one of the ship's crew who had been hit with shrapnel in the leg, assisted him to a gangway where there was a medical team loading them onto the only one lifeboat available, the wounded. I then stood by the door and the ship was burning rapidly. So I had a life jacket on, not the cork ones. So I went in the water. There was no alternative. I must have been in the water for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and eventually finished up on a lighthouse, Raffles Lighthouse, and where there were about 20 others. We sat there watching the Empress of Asia burn about a quarter of a mile away, and were then rescued by another small ship and taken to Singapore. I didn't appreciate. I always liked the old Empress. I had a great feeling, like most sailors or merchants say, couldn't call me a sailor in that short time, but I had a great feeling for it. The troops didn't. The troops hated it, and but they had every right to be. They were soldiers, not sailors, and they were cramped up in the quarters. But I was too busy to get looking after myself and things to worry about the Empress of Asia till I was on the lighthouse, and we had about an hour or so to wait there for someone then to pick us up. And I looked at the Empress of Asia, and she was an old ship. She was about 30 years old, and it was sad to see her burning there. But she would, if only for the war, she would have been sent to a breakage yard. And I thought it was far better for. She sailed in the Pacific in peacetime. And it was far better to end her days as a funeral pyre in the China Sea than as breakage yard in Formosa. So I had very mixed feelings about that. Well, so much is happening, and so much noise, and guns and everything else, bombs landing. You don't think about it to a point. There's no fear. None of the troops panicked. None of the crew panicked. When I was in the water, there were one or two soldiers drowning. They couldn't do much about it. But on the other hand, one soldier came alongside swimming and just said, "It's a nice day for a swim, isn't it?" And there were still bombs falling. And in normal times, it was quite shark infested, that part of the China Sea. But the bombs would have moved them away anyway. So I don't think things happen so quickly and everything else. Just accept it, really. There's no fear. I wasn't frightened. I wasn't scared or anything like that. If you think of what you do yourself, when you look back on it, you could do all the imagining you want and you could relate that. But as each day goes, you don't know what tomorrow brings. Tomorrow's going to bring something different. So there is no, every day is the same, and it's just nighttime that's the worst part. That's the only thing that separates one day from the next. You know the next day there's going to be ill treatment or starvation or whatever it is. But if you did give in, you'll not be part of that. It's easy. The easiest thing in the world is to die. You've only got to give up hope. Just give up hope. You'll die. That's the same with being a prisoner of war and being anything else. So you just don't think of that. You have to become very positive and think that tomorrow it's going to be a different day. If you look back on the 4 years or 3.5 years, you wouldn't go through it again. But each day is going to be something different. each day. It was different, but eventually it comes to an end. Whether you'll survive it is a different thing. Some people can't survive it because they're not well. The disease, I wasn't up on the Quay. A lot of people died up on the bridge on the Quay, mainly through disease and everything else. There wasn't that type of thing in Singapore, even though it was a lot of jungle then. But the jail itself was at least, it was, you slept, you got bit with this, that, the other. We were not allowed to go out. We were not allowed any books. We weren't allowed anything. So we suffered greatly. But I was young. I was still 18, 19, 20, and I had my 21st birthday in there. But I didn't know my birthdays. Time didn't mean anything. It still doesn't mean anything to me. It was my golden wedding anniversary last week before. I'm worried about it. I didn't know my 21st, I didn't know that. When we landed on Singapore Island, we were sent to an army camp up to the north of the island. The Japanese hadn't landed on Singapore then, they were just about to. And the first day we were there, the camp, as a prelude to the invasion, was heavily shelled by the Japanese, and the army camp came under fire. So then a report came that would the catering staff of the Empress of Asia, of which I was a member, volunteer to work in the hospitals, as the government was sending the nurses home through the atrocities that the Japanese had done elsewhere to women. So the whole 140 of us volunteered to work in the hospitals. And I was sent to a hospital, the Tan Tock Seng Hospital in Mool Main Road, and which came immediately under shelling, and the ward I worked in was badly wrecked. So we evacuated the patients to Singapore General Hospital, which was about a mile away. When we got to Singapore General Hospital, conditions were so bad that we stayed. On the first day was there, we tagged 700 people wounded and things. The Japanese had invaded the island, and it's only a small island. It's the size of the Isle of Wight. So the troops were fetching their own wounded into the hospital and everything like that. They were on rickshaws, on bicycles, anything that would carry them. It was chaotic. The dead and the dying were alongside one another. There was no room for anything. There were stone steps going up to the wards. They were absolutely covered in blood and had slippery, actually. Before the war, I'd never seen a dead body. The first one I saw probably was that drowning soldier on the Empress of Asia. After that, I'd seen so many, I was absolutely sick. Not frightened again, but absolutely sick of it. And while I was working in the hospital, Singapore capitulated, surrendered to the Japanese. The morning after the capitulation, we stayed at the hospital. A Japanese general came through, ordering, with an interpreter in front, ordering everybody to bow to him. I'd been brought up in a Church of England school, and I'd been told that an Englishman never bows to anybody but him up there. So rather than bow to the Japanese, I went out through another door. And I would never bow to a Japanese while I was a prisoner, often to my own folly. One of the problems is the air. I got through that. Their Japanese favourite thing was ear bashing. They were smaller than me and they would hit you across the ears. Also, I got too near a bomb on the ship. So the following day, they said that everybody working in the hospital, British, had to line up on what they call the Padang in Singapore, which we did. And then we were marched to Changi Prison, which was about 12 miles away. We did have one stopover halfway, an overnight stop. But there were many Chinese. The Japanese, when they landed, there were over 1 million people on Singapore Island then. There was 100,000 troops, and as well as the Chinese, Tamils and everything else. A lot of the Chinese were pro-British. A lot of them had fought for the British and then gone into their ordinary clothes when the capitulation. And the Japanese knew this. So one of the first things they did was to have a scourge of the Chinese, which was, I think the Chinese called the Su Ching, purification of the Chinese. And every Chinese in Singapore, all over the island, had to go through areas to be vetted. The Japanese must have had Chinese who knew about these Chinese. They were stood there with a blank hood on, and if one of the Chinese going through was a scholar or could speak English or had worked in it, he just nodded. And the Chinese were then taken on the backs of wagons, on backs of vehicles, to several places in Singapore, mostly on the coast. One of the first jobs was to undress the soldiers who were coming in wounded. And the first soldier I had to do had 2 hand grenades around his belt. The front line wasn't that far away. And he wouldn't give them to me. He said, one of them's for the Japanese when they come, the other one's for me. And whether you like it or not, if you don't go away, I'll do it now. So I hadn't much option but to go away, and they sedated him. But that was the feeling. A lot of these soldiers had fought down Malaya. They'd seen the atrocities the Japanese had done to the soldiers who'd fought down Malaya, hanging them, crucifying them on trees and everything else. Even one I saw making dum-dum bullets, which is illegal, cutting the ends of. But they were very, very bitter that this was going to happen. And then, mainly, it was taking the dead down to the mortuary. I was asked to, with another chap, to take a dead Indian officer down to the mortuary. I didn't know where the mortuary was. We didn't know where it was, on a stretcher. And just walked along these corridors, which were absolutely full of dead, and leading to the mortuary. The mortuary was absolutely full. The corridors were absolutely full, and there was nothing we could do except to put him along with the others. He had a batman, a small Indian batman, who was crying all the way while we were transporting them to the mortuary, and he then stayed with them. When it came night, there was no way you could go outside because there were snipers sniping the hospital grounds. So these dead and dying, the dead people, they couldn't, they had to be buried. And fortunately, the hospital had been going to build a water tank. So they dug the foundations, which were huge foundations for this new water tank. And we used that to bury them in. My job was to, at night time, was to load them onto wagons from the mortuary and take them to this hole where they were buried. The Chinese, Malays, Tamils and everyone else were fetching their own dead and dying in. So they all went in alongside one another, whether they were British or not. I think, and I know that the British were named because of the what they call dog tags they hang around the neck. So I'm pretty certain they were named after the war. That was just before we got into Changi. When we got to Changi, and Changi prison was a prison built for 600 Asiatic prisoners. It was purely Asiatic. It was built to hold 600, and there were about 3,000 of us, 3,500 I think. So we were allocated 3 to a cell. The cell was a small sized cell with a stone block in the centre, a stone headrest where the prisoner originally slept, and an Asiatic toilet, that's a squat toilet, by the door. And there was just room. We had no bedding. We'd taken rice sacks in with us. The best place to sleep was the bed, the strong troops lot. There was room on that side for one to sleep, and there was room on this side for this one to sleep. But whoever slept on this side with the length of the cell would either have to sleep with their head or feet near this toilet, and whoever had been there earlier had left it in a filthy condition. So we sat on this block, wondering who was going to sleep on the block and who was having the other places. I was the youngest, so I knew where I was going to sleep. But we objected. One of the chaps was a boss over us on the ship, and he said, "That's mine by right." So we said, "We've no ship, so we've no boss." Anyway, it wouldn't be done. He got a pack of cards out, and he said, "All right, I'll tell you what we'll do." I never knew till then that there were 2 one-eyed jacks in a pack of cards and 2 two-eyed jacks. He said, "The first one-eyed jack out, I'll deal a card to each. The first one-eyed jack can sleep on the bed, the second one can sleep over there, and the other one can please himself." And naturally, he won. A chap called Bill Hughes slept on that one, and I slept for me 2.5 years on this one. The first night, the lights went out. Singapore is light from 6 o'clock in the morning was 6 o'clock at night, and then the Japanese wouldn't. There were no light in them. So I with the walk from the hospital, I had prickly heat on my back with the sweat and that, and when I tried sleeping on the rice sack, it was like sleeping on rough emery. So I slept with my back against the wall. Halfway through the night, I knew I was being eaten alive with something, and there was a terrible smell of aniseed, and the aniseed was coming from the rice sack. So I threw the rice sack in a corner, as did this other chap and this. He was all right. And next morning, lay awake the rest of that night, the next morning found out there were bugs coming out of the crevices in the cell, which was filthy cell, and we never did get rid of them. It was just we'd run out of rice, exactly. So mainly after that, we were the youngest. The rest of the people were mainly internees and people like that. And the block we were in, B block, was next to the guard place. The jail is a very, very big jail. It's a very long, so you only know your own block. You don't know anybody in any others blocks. It was an oil burning jail, and the Japanese wouldn't give it oil, so it meant it was converted to wood burning, which meant they needed about 400 tons of wood a day, and the only way that was by the trees and the jungle, secondary jungle. There wasn't a lot of main jungle on Singapore then. It was well wooded, and I became part of a wood cutting gang with a lot of the other Empress blokes and others, younger elements from some of the other blocks. And I spent most of my days out on a wood trail. My job all the time was on a cross-cut saw, one of the long ones, with another chap. And I spent most of my days, we cut the trees down, somebody else lobbed them up, and that was my 2 years of it. In the beginning, it wasn't so bad. The British had stockpiled tin stuff, and we lived on a lot of that and rice. There was nothing but rice and the tin stuff. And they get on today about out-of-date tins. All rubbish, actually. Some of it was years old. Never came to an end. But when that ran out, Malaya isn't a producing country. It relied on stuff coming in, still does. So the food got less and less. There was rice and dried fish mainly. The Chinese caught fish and dried it. Breakfast, after a while, became a type of rice gruel, like thin gruel. That was that, nothing else. Lunch, we didn't have any because we were working out. We'd used to take a couple of small rolls. The evening meal was rice and a type of vegetable or whatever it was. The cooks did wonders. A lot of the blokes off the ship worked in the kitchens. They were cooks anyway. But there really wasn't enough to live on. And after a while, the rice, we had to collect it from the warehouses in Singapore, or at least a gang had to do that. So naturally, a lot of it was the rice that had been left there for years. There was a lot of weevils in it and that sort of thing. At first, we started to have a weevil cleaning, but that went by the board, and they said just weevils will be protein and didn't bother. If you didn't want it, someone else would eat it. And so that was that. That was when we went on working parties. Sometimes we'd go to a Malay kampong, and that's a little village, and we'd scrounge something off them. At first, they were Japanese guards, and they weren't too bad. I had to bow to them. I wouldn't bow, so I positioned myself. We had to go through the two main gates with this low loader pulled by about half a dozen blokes, and I used to position myself at the back. The first two chaps had to bow first to that guard and then bow to that guard, and everybody else following was supposed to do the same. I didn't. By the time it got to me, I'd just give a quick nod. But I'd got till, and that was how it went on in the beginning. Then the guards changed to Sikhs, who had been police and all this sort of people in Singapore, and they put the Sikhs on guards. And the Sikhs expected us to bow to them just the same. Well, that was a terrible thing, because they'd probably worked for some of these chaps in peacetime. Now they had to bow to them. So I definitely wouldn't bow to them. And I was going through the gates one day, and I didn't even bother. And suddenly there was a heck of a noise, and a big Sikh sergeant had got me by the collar. And he was nattering away, I didn't understand one. We just stopped the trailer for a while. But his shouting fetched the Jap officer of the guard come in. He couldn't understand what the Sikh was on about. So they let the trailer go, and the Sikh and I and the Jap guard had to go and report to one of the officers of the Japanese officers and an interpreter. And I think the Jap guard was trying to tell the officer what it was, I hadn't bowed. And they then fetched an English-speaking interpreter who stood in front of me along with the sergeant, while Lieutenant Saito, I think his name was, asked these questions. And they speak in this bit in English, which I hate to this day. And the Jap guard said something, Saito said something, the Jap guard said, the interpreter said, Lieutenant Saito wants to know why you know bow. I said, the trailer was going too far. So that went that. Hold on. Lieutenant Saito say you liar. So I said, no, I'm not a liar. You call Lieutenant Saito liar. So I got a thump across that, which set my mouth bleeding. And then I had to watch this and behave myself. And the outcome was that they let me go after another couple of handouts. But I had, after the day's work, I had to come back to the gate, and whether it was a Sikh or a Japanese guard, I had to bow right down for half an hour to each one. And that was before anything to eat. Even if I didn't bow low enough, they banged me down. And it didn't bother me that much. At the end of it did bother me, but at the end of it all, I'd learnt a new Japanese word. I wouldn't learn Japanese. I knew 1, 2, 3 and up to 10 with the roll call. And that was Kyuri to bow. Kyuri. And, but I didn't like it. And I'm not lying. I'm typical of 90% of us. But I suffered because in those days I was tall for my age, and I was head and shoulders above many. There was none of these young men with this. I was pretty near the tallest, 6'2", I think I was. And the Japanese didn't like that. They took the mickey out of me. Japanese, small Japanese, English big Japanese boss, and just that sort of thing. Right. After we'd been there about 18 months to 2 years, October 1943, everything was going on pretty near the same as I've described. And then one day, one morning, early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese guards, and there was hundreds of them, and the Kempitai, which is the Japanese military police, shifted everybody out of the cells and go down. We all had a stool. The only thing we could sit on was a stool, and the little workshop made a stool, which was a small stool, handle on it, and we used to carry it everywhere. So we carried that out and sat in the courtyard, and the Japanese guards came and searched everybody's cell. Anything they found, they took it down. And what had happened, the Australians in an Australian SAS party led by a British chap, Major Ivor Lyons, had got an old Japanese fishing boat, the Koko Fu, in Australia. They'd obtained this, and I don't know how many of them came back to Singapore in the dark, and in these folded boats. They landed on one of the small islands near Singapore and sank about 30,000 tons of Japanese shipping with limpet mines. And then they got away without anybody being the wiser. This didn't please the Japanese at all, and they thought at first it was the Chinese that had done it. And then they found it wasn't the Chinese. They knew it wasn't. So they thought it was being organised in Changi prison, and that's why they started this lot. So anything that they found incriminating in your cell, they took out. And if you took it out and your name was called out, you finished up at the Kempitai headquarters in Singapore. About 57 were taken, and my name was called out. I had a book which I used to collect Chinese cigarette packets in. It was just something, again, it was a challenge. I needed a challenge. So when I first went down to the docks, there were a lot of English packets there where the people that had been evacuated. And I used to collect them, and then when they died out, the Chinese would imitate them. And I collected about 200, I think. And then I needed something to stick them in. They were rotting in the cell. So when on a working party in Singapore, in a schoolroom, I saw a pile of exercise books, so I pinched the top one. And when I got it back to Changi, I found it was an exercise book with somebody had been doing pitman shorthand, all the wiggles and squiggles. So I didn't take any notice. I just, with the rice glue from the meal, I stuck all these pictures in. But I did one daft thing on the inside page. I doodled the Empress of Asia, as well as my name. And that's what the Japanese had found. And I was called over to this officer, and I tried to explain what all the wiggles and squiggles are. I said, I don't know particularly. What's the ship? I explained it. But with the whole Kempitai looking for a ship, but they took the book away. They didn't take me away. But after that, they wouldn't let us go out on any fatigues for about 3 months. We just had to sit. Everything, they were still taking people away. Eventually, I think 15 people died in the Kempitai headquarters through it. And I did get my book back eventually after the war, but it's now in a little museum in Cheam, London. Well, I've described the ear bashing. That was their common thing. was ear bashing. And when they themselves were, if you think of the Japanese, 9 out of 10 would take delight in hitting you. You'd get the odd one. They were fed up. They were a long way from home like we were. They would go and get drunk at night. They would, a lot of them were on drugs. A lot of them were homosexuals. And we being young caught a bit of that. They would come at night to cells. Our block was nearest to the guard room. They would try to take it out of you. If you didn't stand up and bow to them, they found an excuse for that. You got hardened to it, but as you got weaker towards the end, it was a bit more difficult. With there being 140 of us off the ship, mainly Liverpool chaps, and lots of them are my age or just a little bit older, it was much better. Even though I was an outsider because I lived here and didn't live in Liverpool. Unless you live within a mile of the pier, everybody's an outsider. I don't know, I was a loner anyway. I'd been brought up in the country and I was used to being a loner. So I lived my life a loner. The finest bloke I ever knew, though I was brought up in a Christian, a Church of England school, was a Roman Catholic father. Whenever I got low, Father Cosgrave would come and give me a good talking to, and he was a wonderful man. Those that had worked up on Thailand, they were coming back. And the Japanese wanted somewhere to put them. They were in worse state than we were. So they decided to move us out to let them come in. And there were more and more of them than ever we did. And we moved to an old RAF, what had been an RAF camp, at Sime Road, which is in the centre of Singapore. It's still was a jungly place, but it wasn't like it is now. And it was very dilapidated. It was built of atap, that's palm leaves, when it was originally built. And it had done its share of that and 3.5 years beside. We didn't need a wood fatigue anymore. So most of the time was spent actually in Sime Road. We didn't get out too much, and what we did when we went out was what they call lalang clearing. There was that's the long grass with very sharp blades, and rats used to go through it with typhus germs on it, go through the long grass. The little ticks had come off on the line. Somebody walked through and would get typhus, and we had a typhus outbreak. So we spent a lot of time on that. It wasn't as hygienic. We started to get malaria. We started to get dysentery. Started to get beriberi greatly, which is a deficiency, and we became quite ill at times. The malaria I got, the Japanese wouldn't give us quinine or anything like that. So when we went out on working parties, we'd call it a Malay kampong, which is the village, and when a Jap had gone somewhere else, we'd ask them, are there any quinine? So if they gave it us, it was in half a coconut shell, and it was raw quinine, unrefined quinine, and we all took a sip of it each and shared it around. And when when you drank it, it was like having your first cigarette, and you just went giddy. And it didn't help it, actually. And when I came home, I still had this quinine, and eventually I got a very bad blood problem, and which was eating all my platelets up, and apparently it was this rough quinine had damaged my spleen, and I had to have my spleen out. And most of us suffered with blood problems. The dysentery, you'd go to the toilet sometimes, which were outside, and this was in Sime Road. It goes as many as 35 times a night. There was no cure for that. The only thing we took for that was china clay mixed in water. Drink the china clay mixed in water. If that bunged you up, fair enough. It stopped the dysentery, stopped the diarrhea, but it gave you another problem that it was blocking the inside. So we had plenty of Epsom salts. So you took Epsom salts to try and do that. We didn't have dental treatment, and we didn't have toothbrushes. I used to clean my teeth with a twig, flattened, and wood ash. And when the war was over, on my report it said needs dental treatment. And the dentist I first saw said, you only need a white one for a snooker set. It had every other colour. I had to have a tooth out. I'd got an abscess on a tooth. You didn't go unless you had to. And I had a raging tooth at this moment. So I went to this so-called dentist in a cell further up, go and see this. They had no anaesthetic. So they had all the equipment, every bit of equipment. That wasn't bad. I sat in a chair like this. Somebody sat behind me. They opened my mouth. They rubbed a carbolic on there, on his gums, and then he whipped this tooth out, and I must have let it out a yell that they could hear anywhere. He got the tooth out, and I said, I'm very sorry for doing that. This chap was holding me, and I couldn't do much about it. And when I came to England, it must have been yanked out. But that was the dental treatment. There's not a lot said about them things. You got on with it. The war ended when the British planes came over and capitulated. I am firmly of the belief that if the atom bomb had been, as a Christian, it hurts me. I don't like to see women and children suffer. But if the atom bombs hadn't been dropped, there would have been no Far East prisoners of war left. If the British had invaded Malaya in earlier than the 2 weeks later that they were going to do, I feel we were digging our own digging in our own pits to be buried in. When we were on the wood fatigues, after we'd cut the trees down, another gang uprooted them, took the roots, and they went into charcoal pits that we'd dug, people had dug, which were big dug pits, and they were made into charcoal for the Japanese to use. When the war finished, we were digging those, but there was no wood, no forests in there. And that's the same things happened when you talk to POWs. And I have some documentation. And I know that another fortnight, I think all POWs would have been exterminated. But that's that. The when the war was over, there was no cheers or anything like that. We're too fed up with it. There was no British in sight. Then a plane dropped with doctors on, and they came into the camps, but only half a dozen. Many chaps were very, very ill, and they couldn't get ships in because of the minefields. So it took quite a few weeks before the first ship came in. Then there had to be hospital ships going back to India with the badly. So we stayed till nearly the end. One ship that came in was HMS Sussex, and on board it, I visited it when it came on just for something to do. And there was a chap I'd been to school with at Stratton, up the road. And a girl from Stratton School had sent me a letter. And I don't tell. I didn't tell. Said, I asked him, I said, is Marion Peace still living? Do you know Marion? I said, yes, I do. He said, I married her. A lot of dear Johns there was, my friend. The ship I came home on, as soon as I got on board it, I didn't feel me. Everything, I didn't know why, but I knew it was me. I finished up in hospital on it on the first 2 nights for no reason at all. I just knew I couldn't face anything. It was about a month's voyage back. When I got to Liverpool, nothing had changed. The only thing that had changed was me. I'd changed completely. I didn't know why I'd changed. They sent us to an RAF place for an X-ray, and the following day dropped us off at home and just said, you're here, get yourself, either go back to sea in 6 weeks, give you 6 weeks, or do whatever. That was it. I knew I couldn't go back to sea. And I didn't know why. I was frightened to death I was frightened of everything about. And it was many, many, many years later, even when I got married 50 years ago, I didn't tell my wife that I'd been a prisoner. And it happened when I knew I couldn't stand confined spaces. If I went to a football match, I stood near the entrance. If I went for a haircut, I couldn't go for a haircut. If I went to the pictures, it was an end seat. Church, it was an end seat. I'd never heard of claustrophobia. I didn't know what it meant. I thought I was an oddity. I thought something had happened to me. And I didn't tell Merle, but she knew I was not the bloke that used to meet her and pick her up, being married to her. I still wouldn't explain to her. Then she wanted to go to Liverpool, and I prayed that the train we went on from Warrington to Liverpool was either one with a corridor or a stopping train. I knew if it was one of these box-type trains that went straight through, I couldn't go on it. I felt like throwing myself out of the opening the carriage door and jumping. So I sat there and waiting for the train to go off, and just before it went off, I jumped out, and I said, I'll see you in Liverpool. And I caught a stopping train, half an hour. So she waited on Liverpool station about 2 or 3 hours for me. So then it came, which didn't make married life any easier. Then it came out on the radio that all ex-Japanese prisoners of war should go to the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine because they were finding out that a germ called strongyloids was affecting. And this was a little worm that had been caught on such as these rice sacks. And it was still living after 20, 30 years. And they found out that it could cause problems with an anaesthetic. If you had an anaesthetic and you had strongyloids, you were in very danger. So they sent us to the School of Tropical Medicine in Liverpool. The doctor there told me I hadn't got strongyloids, but he said, you've got two problems. One's your hearing, get it seen to, or you cut yourself off. And the other is you've got a mental problem. And that was the first time I knew. Said, I'd like you to see a friend of mine, a Dr. Khan at Arrow Park Hospital, Birkenhead, who specialises in Far East and POW things. Will you go? I said, yes, I'll go. Well, and he said, you're exactly like 98% of you. He said, but I'm 25 years too late. And he spoke to me for about an hour and a half. And if he'd told me that right at the beginning, I wouldn't have had 25 years of misery. I thought I was the only one. And we never spoke about it. The POW, they never said anything about the things happening. I still suffer with it, but for the sake of my children who are now grown up and retired and all this sort of thing, it doesn't affect me that greatly. But it's taken a lot out of Merle. She's lovely, and she's really, without her I'd have been dead 20 years ago, 30 years ago.